Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Anibal honey processed Colombia from Banibeans Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Banibeans, based out of Ljubljana, Slovenia. And once again, they were a suggestion to us by Ljubljana. So for the final time, a shout out to and thank you to Ljubljana for the suggestion. This coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video where I finished first place out of 4 Banibeans coffees on that day. And whenever a coffee does finish first place in one of our blind taste test rankings videos, it's always interesting to see if it retains its status as our favorite from those coffees. So we will see if this one did. This right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee has been in line with our previous experiences with this coffee roaster, which is to say that it is on the lighter side of things, if not necessarily an overly light coffee, so on the lighter side by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20 blind taste test day, and interestingly enough for me, there was a surprising level of clarity for this one, as there was extraordinarily little fermentiness in the cup, but rather a clean and sweet profile, including a very nice peachy aspect, which wasn't necessarily something I was expecting, even though they did have a peach note listed on here, as that's not something I traditionally experience from honey processed Colombian coffees. Nonetheless, slightly candied with a lingering and long-lasting finish, so a great start, and that's why it left the best first impression from those 4 coffees. Day 23 opted for the Chemex, and it interestingly continues to remain on the cleaner side of things with a much sweeter peachiness to the cup, as the peach sweetness comes through a bit more in a candied finish, more like a peach candy as opposed to a fresh fruit peach. Even then, it's still really nice. I'm still enjoying the experience I'm having from it, so another nice day on day 2. Day 26 through the April brewer, and there's a bit more intensity to the cup through this brew method, though the fermentiness has still kept at bay, with the cup skewing a little bit more on the cleaner side of things. The peach candy still remains present with an additional sweeter component, including a very slight caramelized aspect and a sugary stone fruit as well. Slightly citric, but for the most part, still very positive. So we continue on to day 29 through the V60, and I said, let's risk it. Higher temperatures, more fine grind. Interestingly enough to me, it continues to remain on the sweeter side of things with a little more focus on the sugary candy bar-like attributes. And at this time, I would say that it was quite reminiscent of a Cadbury chocolate with caramel, as there is a slight zesty brightness to the cup. But for the most part, it continues to remain on this sweeter side of things in a couple of senses, but most specifically more of those stone fruit components. Day 32 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this is the time I felt like I might have pushed it a little too far, as it wasn't necessarily yielding the best results with the increased extraction on the Chemex, as it has an above average clarity, but the fermentiness is felt a slight bit more, and I said, this is probably the breaking point, let's not push this any further. The previously mentioned peach candy is still present, but in a slightly more fermenty red fruit sense with a lingering zesty brightness yet again. So positive still, but I didn't want to keep playing with it, as the cup up to that point had been wonderful. So back through the V60 with our more standard recipe, and at this time it was much more reminiscent of that Cadbury cream egg with a very strong sweetness to the cup in a candied stone fruit sense. More of the lingering citric brightness yet again, but more clarity as well, and that was a really nice trade-off for me. Day 38 through the V60, and I said that this was going to be my preferred brew method and recipe going forward, as there's still great intensity to the cup with notably less fermentiness and still a very strong sugariness as well. The brew just yields better peachiness and caramelized sweetness, which are 2 things I just very much enjoy in general, and given that the clarity's strong enough to the point where those things having the intensity that they do kind of combines together in a really nice way. Day 41, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there was a slight inconsistency on this day, as there was a little bit more focus on the kind of Cadbury cream egg chocolate-like component to it, and a bit more emphasis on the brighter fruit aspects. a somewhat slight fermenty red berry, but I said, okay, by the end, I think we got enough cups that I really enjoyed that, even if it is kind of skewing a slight bit in this direction. For the most part, I really enjoyed the way that this coffee was throughout. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those. And we will actually start with the finish at a level 4. Given that anytime we have any non-wash processed coffee, I always fear that that might trigger a higher than level 4 for the finish, but in this case it did not, as the finish was really even, and I had a lot of positive things to say about the finish itself, as at times it might have skewed a little bit more in that citric direction or that kind of zesty brightness that I've described. Level 4 nonetheless, perfect spot for this one. We continue on to the sweetness at a level 4. This one was easily the sweetest of the 4 coffees that we're going to be discussing from Banibeans, or that we discussed from Banibeans. And the sweetness came in multiple directions, but most specifically a candied direction, that kind of chocolate caramel, as well as that candied peach sense to it. So level 4 definitely seems like a pretty good fit for that. Acidity, level 4. There you go. All 4 of these coffees that we're discussing from them all reached that level 4 for acidity, and continues to show the emphasis they do have on the brightness of their coffees, as it's not necessarily my favorite, but I can't fault it if there's nothing wrong with it. I felt like the acidity, the brightness being present in all of these coffees added depth, added a little bit of just layering to the cups, as that is something that I continued to make remarks about every single coffee that we discussed from them. So level 4, fine. I don't really have too much to say on that. Stone fruit, level 4, and what really won me over at the very start of this coffee relative to the other coffees we're discussing from them was the peachy aspect of it. So having that reach that level 4 mark throughout, and at times be the most pronounced characteristic to this coffee, especially when I was able to get it as the most pronounced characteristic, was a really nice positive, even if it's not necessarily the type of peachiness I prefer. That's being a little nitpicky, having a little bit more of a peach candy as opposed to some other fruit profile as the lead components to it is always going to be a nice selling point to me. And then the final level 4 we have to discuss is the cleanliness, and I actually saved that for last when it comes to discussing these level 4s, because I was really surprised. I have had really negative experiences with any Colombian coffee that isn't washed. I'll be completely honest, even some wash processed Colombian coffees that I'm not reviewing or discussing, I've had some issues with, as they do tend to come out more of a red fruit forward cup. So having this one be at that level 4 cleanliness while still being a honey processed Colombian coffee is easily going to be the biggest victory in itself. So massive credits to the coffee roaster on this one for continuing to keep that clarity throughout. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the florality. Level 3, bit more of a generic floral sense to it, but I think as we're kind of roaming through this tasting wheel, you'll see that a lot of these things reach those level 3 marks without maybe a specific indicator to it, because the coffee did seem to have a heightened focus on other things, as the spice attribute is another one, as I felt a fair bit of spice qualities from all of the Banibeans coffees that we're reviewing and discussing, but this one right here just has a little higher of a mark at that level 3 sense. Berry fruit, level 3. I think that played a role towards the end with it having a little bit more of those red berry fruit attributes. Even then, earlier on, it wasn't too pronounced. It's just one of those things that came up a little bit more towards the end. Citrus fruit, level 3. And that's another thing that's been pretty consistent throughout the Banibeans coffees we've discussed, is that there's always some sort of citric quality to them. So that one right there, scoring at the level 3 mark, yes, continues to go along the lines of what we've had. Chocolate and caramel in level 3. We'll discuss those side by side, because I really appreciated the definition in that sense. I feel like maybe if there's one reason they're only there at that level 3 mark as opposed to level 4 is because the candied attribute of the peach was a little bit more pronounced and prominent for me for the majority of this coffee. Though I think as we're going around this tasting wheel, you're seeing that this coffee actually had really nice balance to it, as there are very few things that score above a level 3 and very few things that score below that level 2. Actually, everything's, for the most part, the majority of this tasting wheel is in that level 3 or level 2 range. So that just goes to show the balance that's within this one. Smokiness level 3, level 2. I don't think that there's necessarily a developed smoky quality to it. I just think it's a component of what this coffee is in general, as it was ever so slightly present at certain times, and it was in the sense of that kind of chocolate attribute. So I had to put it there at that level 2 mark. I guess we skipped over a couple of other important things. Savoriness, level 3. There was an interesting tea-like attribute to it, and I would say it was a little bit more in line with that, and maybe that was a good reason to go in terms of that smokiness, as it was kind of like a we'll just say slightly more earthy tea attributes to it, and that's why those things are at that mark. And then I think the final thing that's actually worth discussing is the body at a level 3, because I've been saying this entire time that making these tasting wheels side by side for all 4 of these coffees, it really allows you to determine what the texture and body is of all of these coffees side by side. And this one's a little bit more in line with that natural processed Ethiopian coffee than any of the other ones we discussed, which is to say, fair bit of texture, not necessarily the most, but still enough structure to it that it did score at that level 3. As I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that this is the best representation of this coffee, if not necessarily the overly truest representation, as I feel like at this point, and probably at this point going forward, it might skew slightly down in terms of the clarity, maybe a little bit more of those red fruits, but for the majority of what I had from this coffee, I think it's a good representation of what I was getting. All right. So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I feel like the Cramo is the one that improved the most from the first time I tried it, but this one had such a gap between it and the Cramo the first time I tried both of these coffees that even with the Cramo improving as much as it did, this one was still my favorite. This one improved slightly for the majority of the time I was drinking it, and even if at the end it's kind of going in a direction that isn't necessarily overly appealing to me, the majority of the time I was having this coffee, it's the one that caught my interest the most, and that's the best takeaway I have from this coffee, is it's the one that interested me the most. The wash processed Kenyan coffee, the wash processed Ethiopian coffee, they're what I was expecting from washed Ethiopians and Kenyan coffees, and then the natural processed Ethiopian coffee was very much what I was expecting from a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. While I didn't have too many expectations for this one right here, I haven't had too many Colombian coffees that have tasted somewhat similar to this one, and I think that's what makes this one unique, stand out, and the one that caught my interest the most from this coffee roaster. And I've heard some interesting things about this producer and the coffees that they've released being a very heavy coffee, which doesn't surprise me given that they are Colombian coffees. But that's credit to them on this one as well as the roaster, because I found this one to be enjoyable. Clarity being at that level 4, sweetness being at the level 4. We finally found something that I was looking for from these Banibeans coffees while still offering something a little bit more unique. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you're like me and you do really enjoy the candied attributes of coffees, and this one has a lot of candied aspects to it, most specifically the peachiness, and that's the first direction I want to point somebody towards, because it's not your traditional everyday fresh fruit sort of peach, but just that different sugary peach component to it, while still offering, interestingly, that very nice definition to that Cadbury cream egg. I actually opened this bag, obviously, to brew this coffee, and while I opened the bag, I was able to get a very strong aroma of that Cadbury cream egg while opening this bag, which is to say that I think my brewing just honestly brought it out, but I think it's always been present within this coffee. I think that's the best way I can actually leave this review as well. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Anibal honey processed Colombia from Banibeans Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.